Good evening, I'm Beth George. Welcome to this edition of Louisiana, the state we're in. This week we look at the legacy of Huey P. Long, whose birthday the state observed a few days ago. We visit some physical reminders of the kingfish, profile an historian whose biography fired interest in the Winfield-born politician, and speak with Long's most active legacy, his son Russell. In many parts of the country, Huey Long is little more than a colorful historical footnote, but in Louisiana, his shadow or guiding light is everywhere, and nobody is lukewarm about which it is. Even today, 47 years after his assassination, Long is both damned and praised for setting up the state's political system, which continues to mystify and intrigue outside observers. He studded the state with monuments to his reign: roads, bridges, charity hospitals, his skyscraper capital, his governor's mansion, and his great love, LSU. For all his lasting contributions, however, Long remains an enigma. Was he a demagogue, a fascist, a communist, a dictator, a populist Democrat? Some scholars now say he was all these things, and he, of course, maintained he was a type unto himself. Long's self-assessment has some validity, for in an impoverished era when men had enough trouble just being men, he said and sang that they could be considerably more. The liveliness of Long's image got a boost recently when singer Randy Newman recorded an album packed with references to the kingfish, including Long's own Every Man a King. At a recent outdoor concert, Newman told how he became interested in Huey Long.
I read the T. Harry Williams book. I can't remember whether a guy came to me with an idea for a musical of all the King's Men. And I read all the King's Men. And then I read the biography, and it's so much more, it's even a better theatrical thing as real life than what they made of it, lying in the streets or all the King's Men. And it interested me. It was a fantastic kind of character.
Politician one historian called the Messiah of the Rednecks confounded such views by building an elegant mansion in Baton Rouge. Huey's house is now being restored. This house was built in what year, Adelaide?
1930.
And it was built by, at that time, Governor Huey Long.
Governor Huey Long.
How long did he live here?
Well, a few months, I would guess, because soon after that he was elected to the Senate, and so he had to go to Washington.
The idea has been to restore this house to its original glory, I understand. Yeah. Isn't it sort of unusual to have a museum that is so current? We're just really talking about fairly recent history. What's the philosophy behind it?
Well, one, it's less expensive, and two, it's much more accurate to do a house of our immediate past. And then I think the most important thing of all is in 25 or 50 years from now, we will have a really significant historic site because it will grow. But I think it really has importance now because the Huey Long era is an era of great popular appeal and importance in Louisiana politics, and I guess national politics as well.
Do you notice that most visitors know who Huey Long was?
Oh, yes, they all know. They all know the story of Huey Long.
Adelaide, we're standing here in the dining room of what used to be Huey Long's governor's mansion. Is this room being restored pretty much to the way it was during Huey's time?
Yes, I think it's faithfully restored, and even to the wallpaper and the place setting, crystal, and so on.
The wallpaper is rather unusual. Tell us something about the history of it.
Well, it really is a famous wall pattern that was printed in France for, I think, 200 years and is still available if one has the money to purchase it. And this was the original paper, and Imo Brown, you know, is the restoration chairman, and she had this paper ordered again, so it's back on the wall.
Was this mansion a very elegant one for its time?
I think so, because the mansion itself cost $150,000 to build, and the furnishings were very elegant because they had a price tag of $22,000, and that was a huge sum in 1930.
Let's walk on down here into the East Room. Is that what we call it now?
Yes.
What was the East Room used for?
Well, that was the reception hall, the living room, the formal gathering place for dignitaries. And there's a smaller sitting room upstairs.
What's original in this room?
Well, the wingback chair is original. It's a new fabric is on it now, but that was the original piece. And then the other pieces are replicas of the original and pretty close to what they were.
We have a beautiful marble fireplace here. Was this here?
Yes, that was original. All the architectural detail is as it was.
You know, I think a lot of people think of Huey Long as having been somebody with, say, not a lot of culture of expression, you know, rather outspoken, flamboyant kind of person. But this is really a very, it's a formal room, and the mansion was formal. Do you think maybe he wasn't quite as much a good old boy as some thought?
I think that part of that must have been myth, because when we talked to the last living architect of the firm of Weiss, Seaforth, and Dreyfus, Mr. Seaforth, who's quite old now, said that Governor Huey Long, came to him and said, I just want an elegant Georgian mansion. There was never any discussion about this being a second White House. And
that's a story I think that's interesting. It was said that Huey had this governor's mansion built with all, with the light fixtures the same as in the White House. Isn't that true? What is that story?
Well, the architect said there was really no discussion of this ever being a second White House. He just wanted a very elegant Georgian mansion, and that's what it turned out to be. And I think very understated and formal, as you say.
Adelaide, we're standing here in what used to be a library during Huey Long's time. This was his desk, I understand?
Well, we know that Huey Long, Governor Long, was the last governor to use this desk, but we don't know how many used it before him. It's an old desk.
Are there any other original pieces in this room?
These two chairs belong to Governor Huey Long, and this desk.
One of the most attractive rooms in the restored mansion is known as Little Rose's bedroom. It was used by Rose Long, one of Huey's children. On the wall hangs a portrait of Huey's wife, Rose, wearing the gown she wore to her daughter's wedding. For years, portraits of Long, like this one in the mansion, hung in places of honor across the state. But Huey's most striking image, his most powerful political legacy, is his son Russell, longtime chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. Though he idolizes his father, both as a man and as a political leader, he sees the courses of their careers in sharp contrast.
My father was a governor before he became a United States Senator. And as a governor, he built more than any governor in the history of this state, and compared to his time, he did more building than any governor of any state of the Union. He built enough highways in the 4 years while he was holding sway down here than anybody ever conceived. He built enough concrete highways in just 4 years to build you a good road all the way from New Orleans to Chicago, and another one all the way from New Orleans to New York City. And that started out from a little state that didn't have but 70 miles of concrete highways in the whole state. He was a fantastic builder, both with regard to bridges, roads, hospitals, the state university, the state capitol building, and moving ahead public education. He was a great get-it-done man. Now, I haven't had the opportunity to be a governor, an administrator. My service has been entirely that of a legislator, and I don't want to make any invidious comparison, but I passed a lot more laws and put a lot more legislation in the statute books than my father did. I had the advantage of time. I've been a senator for 29 years, and my father had his life cut short when he'd only been there 4 years.
With a double cloud of seniority and persuasiveness, Russell Long has for years been a man to contend with on Capitol Hill. The senator has been viewed as precisely what he calls his father, a get-it-done man, and he's pleased by the resurgence of interest in the kingfish, though he has mixed feelings about some of the projects.
I don't know just what makes a resurgence of interest. I think that Professor Harry Williams, writing that book about Huey Long, did a lot to bring out information that people had not known or had not been cognizant of before. I think it was a good job. I don't agree with everything in Mr. Williams' books because I'm a Huey Long idolater, you might say. I just idolize the man, but that book by Harry Williams, I think, did a lot to stir interest. Now, the movie rights of that book have been purchased by a man named Bick, and they're working on a scenario to do a full-length movie, which they hope to be a reasonably authentic thing. But we'll just have to judge by the results. I don't think what the network did a while back, let's see, who was that? I believe it was NBC. But whether NBC or CBS, I don't think that was fair at all, and I so expressed myself to them. They did make a couple of changes along the line that I suggested that made it somewhat more fair than it would have been otherwise, but you know it did not get very good reviews, and I sort of feel like it justified the poor reviews it had because it wasn't a very good movie. It just wasn't accurate at all in my judgment.
As Russell Long pointed out, national interest in his father was ignited in 1969 by a comprehensive biography. LSU professor T. Harry Williams picked up both a Pulitzer Prize and a National Book Award for his work, which contrasts the coldly realistic politics of Long with the romantic illusions of the Old South. To Williams, Long was far more than a Southern demagogue. He was a modern mass leader, a thoroughly American political boss, endowed with extraordinary political instincts. About your book, Huey Long, do you think that it has had a tremendous impact more than anything else you've written on your career, and were you surprised by the reactions to it?
Well, I think it's, of all my books, I would say that's 14, 15, depending on how you count them, that is the one that won me the most attention. And I suppose that in many ways my name has become connected with the Huey Long book, and that some people maybe have forgotten that I wrote some other books on the Civil War and military history, and that I'm going to write other books. But yes, it had a great impact on my career, but not, I hope, on my personality. I don't think I've got wedded to that book myself as being the only thing that I ever did.
Okay. Do you sometimes get tired of answering questions about Huey Long or doing interviews? I think you did a famous one with Barbara Walters on the Today Show that you weren't too pleased with.
Well, that's because I didn't get to talk as much as I wanted to. But I am getting a little bit weary now of being asked to give brief characterizations of Huey Long, and I feel that I'm repeating myself ad nauseum, and that people who hear me must have heard all this over and over again. I give still a number of lectures on college campuses, particularly about Huey Long, but I've tried to restrict my appearances on that subject in Louisiana in recent years because I'm sure most people have heard this over and over, and I don't want to bore them too much.
In the beginning of your book, you indicated that whether you were going to do a pro-Long or an anti-Long book, you were looking at a man whose life affected history, really. He was a mover. You're doing another book on certainly a mover, Lyndon Johnson. Is this consistent with your earlier writings?
I think so. There are many similarities between Huey Long and Lyndon Johnson. Of course, they're different, but in many ways they're very much alike. They're both Southern politicians. They're both Southern politicians as I see them on the left. Men who wanted to lead the masses, men with a great deal of color, wonderful vocabularies, lovers of power. So I think it's logical that having written Huey Long, I should now write a life of Lyndon Johnson. He's like Huey Long, only in a later period.
Does it make you angry when people say maybe you were soft on Huey Long and suggesting that maybe Lady Bird wanted you because you might be soft on Lyndon?
Well, Lady Bird didn't want me. I decided to do this myself. And as a matter of fact, there are about 4 or 5 other writers who are currently working on studies of Lyndon Johnson. And each one of them, like myself, is acting on his own initiative. Now, of course, I saw Mrs. Johnson, and these other writers will too, because her cooperation is important. She can provide a lot of recollections about her husband, but she didn't choose anybody to write a biography. Each one of these persons is acting on his own initiative.
You're not originally from Louisiana. How did you come here, and do you consider yourself now a native since you've been here many years?
Well, I came here in '41 and from the Middle West because I was offered at that time what was a good job, and LSU then was known as an up-and-coming university, a young university on the move upward, and there was a lot about the local scene that was exciting. And I came, and although there have been times in the past when things happened I didn't like, I stayed, and in the end was glad I had stayed, and I consider myself now, I think, a representative of Louisiana, yes.
We've heard a lot recently about publish or perish, and the idea also of having professors being able to perform well in the classroom to attract students. You've always had the reputation, so you've certainly published, but you've always also had the reputation of being just a wonderful lecturer. People are turned away in droves from your classes. How have your classes changed the students over the years? And I want to ask you one other thing. Did you really wear a Confederate uniform to introduce a Civil War lecture one time?
Well, in the first place, I never wore a Confederate uniform or any other uniform. That's a myth that's got started and has become widely believed. At the end of one class, when classes were much smaller than they are now, the students in the class presented me with a Union cavalry jacket. It was a genuine uniform of the Civil War period. And they had thought I would like it, and they'd bought it for me, and they asked me to put it on, which I did. And then it was very uncomfortable, so I took it off right away. But I think that must be the origin of the myth that I wore a uniform to class, and it's grown with the years, and I'm sure a lot of people, if I said I never wore one, still wouldn't believe me.
Do you believe in spicing your lectures with humorous anecdotes?
Well, I believe that a lecture should be informative, it should be entertaining, and it should be inspirational. At least it should excite people. And you've got to put into a lecture, I think, all elements that will achieve or try to achieve, come close to achieving all those 3 goals. And I think a lecture should be entertaining, but it should be the other 2 things too.
Dr. Williams, do you think that there is a conflict between having a teacher who is good in the classroom or having one that can publish?
I have some very strong feelings on that. I recognize that in a large university there are going to be a number of teachers, and probably a large number of teachers in the introductory courses, the survey courses, who are not going to publish and should not be asked to publish. But the ideal, I think, in many departments that we should strive for is to get men and women who are both good teachers and who are going to publish significant research. And there's no contradiction between those 2 activities. People who are not doing a good job teaching are not doing a poor job because they're doing research. They probably would be ordinary performers anyway. And actually, I think the most exciting teacher is one who is researching and who has skill in presentation, because he's finding something new. He is not existing on the husks of other people's findings, and he can communicate that excitement, I think, to his students. So I think the best teacher, providing that he is skilled in presentation, is the one who is also engaged in research.
And you are certainly researching. We're surrounded here by notes everywhere in your study. What are the projects you're working on right now?
I'm trying to finish History of U.S. Wars for the general reader. and I'm through with World War I now, so I'm beginning to see a little light at the end of the tunnel. And then at the same time, I'm doing research on this projected life of Lyndon Johnson. The completion of that, of course, will be several years in the offing.
And what's in the future for you? Do you think they're going to let you retire?
Well, legally, I have to retire when I'm 70, which will be, this academic year and then the one after that. And I presume that I will at the end of that time, although I will hate to do it.
Huey Long is a figure in history, a subject for biographies such as Williams, precisely because of the strong hand he took in shaping the Louisiana we know today. Dr. Tom Carlton has looked at Long from two perspectives. As professor of Louisiana history at LSU, he outlined for students the Kingfish's career. And now as research director for the Public Affairs Research Council, he studies the political forms Long had a large say in creating. Dr. Carlton, it's Huey Long's birthday this week, and we're doing a little sort of perspective, maybe seeing what legacies there are left from Huey's administration. What are some of the ones perhaps that have been ascribed to him? I think you've divided into several categories.
Yes, I have three categories of legacies. The first are those which were erroneously ascribed to Long, and I have two of them. The first is that Long originated corrupt government in Louisiana. Well, Long did not originate corrupt government in this state. What he did do, I think, was to extend the circle of coverage by creating a broadly based political machine of his own with an organization in every parish. So while we had had corruption before Long, he sort of extended it and popularized it by creating his own large political machine.
I think a lot of people attribute the fact that we have a strong governor to the fact that Huey was such a strong governor. You don't think that is indeed a legacy?
No, not in the sense that Long originated it. Long, after all, having come on the scene 50 years ago, is getting pretty close to being the only strong governor, really strong governor in living memory, you see. So most people living today believe that he was the first strong governor, when he wasn't. We've had them all during our history. And as far as legislative independence goes, when you recall that during the colonial period we had no legislature, we have made, I think, startling progress in the last 15 or 20 years in finally arriving at something like legislative independence, because it's not in our tradition.
He did give us a legacy of unusual factions, political factions within the state, Long, anti-Long, that carried over long after he was governor. Is that still with us today?
This was a genuine legacy of Long, which I think has tended to fade away during the past 5 or 6 years. You're speaking of what we call bifactionalism. That is the dichotomy between the Longites in the state Democratic Party and the anti-Longites. Well, that arose in the late 1930s after Huey died and continued to operate pretty effectively until about 1964, when John McKithen was elected governor. During that period of time, we alternated pretty regularly between a conservative, anti-Longite governor and a fairly liberal Longite governor, usually Earl Long. But then Earl died in 1960, and no member of the Long family has either been willing or able to assume his mantle here in the state. McKithen himself was something of a composite figure. He had both Longite and anti-Longite tendencies. And with his election and 8-year administration, bifactionalism has tended to sort of fade into history.
We've been talking about some of legacies that have been erroneously attributed to Long, some of the legacies of Huey Long that have faded away into the past. What are those that are with us today, though?
I see two major legacies that are still in evidence today. One is that Long, perhaps unintentionally, activated the antipathy between business and industry on the one side and organized labor on the other in Louisiana. Now, this antipathy didn't exist prior to Long because the business and industry were in the ascendancy up to the time that he took over in 1928, and labor was not yet organized. And Long himself really wasn't committed to organized labor because in his own time it remained too weak to be a factor of consequence to him politically. But Long did support the future members of labor unions in Louisiana, blue-collar and many white-collar working men and women. And his followers, the Longites, have generally been on the side of organized labor, while his opponents and their followers have generally been friends of business and industry.
You see this as a sort of preview of the lobby and AFL-CIO controversy in the legislature?
Yes, of course, you can't project the present back into the past, and we do that at our peril, but if the lobby leaders were alive in the 1920s and early 30s, I think they would certainly be in opposition to Huey Long, and perhaps the AFL-CIO would be more inclined to support him. In other words, what's happened is that the liberal, pro-labor Democrats of today can trace their philosophy back to the Longites, while the conservative, pro-business Democrats and Republicans would have opposed Huey 50 years ago.
What's something else we can trace directly to Huey?
Oh, I think what could best be called the power of mass politics. Prior to Long, Louisiana was run by a very conservative plutocracy that gave the people very little, whether they needed it or wanted it. Now, Long ushered in a government based on ask and you shall receive. Organize and send a lobbyist or two, or 200, to Baton Rouge, and if you're patient and wait long enough, you can usually get a part, if not all of what you want. Perhaps that's the way the system ought to work, but I think in the same context, we've gone from one extreme to the other.
Do you think present governors, no matter what, live in the shadow of Huey, that he still, even though it's been a really long time since his death, his name is still so familiar to nearly every person in Louisiana? Do you think they indeed have his shadow? I mean, when they look out from their office, they see his statue right down there in the Capitol that he built.
Well, I think as time passes, the intensity of his shadow becomes increasingly pale, and I think within another generation or two, his immediate influence will have paled considerably. But the statue remains, the memory remains, and as long as both are in evidence in Louisiana, I think we'll have to cope with it as best we can. He's become a permanent part of our history.